Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., December 28, 2011, to the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Christopher A. Coons, a senator from the state of Delaware, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
Under the previous order, leadership time is reserved, and pursuant to the order of the Senate on January 24, 1901, as amended by the order of February 17, 2011, the senator from Georgia, Mr. Isakson, will now read Washington's farewell address.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my DOD fellow Julia Spain, Francie Powers, and Michael McLaughlin be allowed to have floor privileges during the reading of Washington's farewell address.
Without objection, so ordered.
Friends and fellow citizens, the period for a new election of a citizen to administer the executive government of the United States being not far distant, and the time actually arrived when your thoughts must be deployed in designating the person to whom you clothe with the importance of this trust, it appears to me proper, especially as it may conclude to the more distinct expression of the public voice, that I should now appraise you of the resolution I have formed to decline being considered among the number of those out of which one will be chosen. I beg you at this time to do me the justice to be assured that this resolution was not taken lightly, without a strict regard to all considerations appertaining to the relation which binds a dutiful citizen to his country, and that in withdrawing the tender of service which silence in my situation might imply, I'm influenced by no diminution of the zeal of your future interest, no deficiency of grateful respect for your past kindness. But I am supported by a full conviction that the step is incompatible with both. The acceptance of and continuance hitherto in the office to which your suffrages have twice called me have been a uniform sacrifice of inclination to the opinion of duty and to the deference for what appears to be your desire. I constantly hoped it would have taken much earlier in my power, consistent with motives which I am not at liberty to disregard, to return to that retirement from which I had been reluctantly drawn. The strength of my inclination to do this, previous to the last election, had even led to the preparation of an address to declare it to you. But mature reflection of the then perplexed and critical posture of our affairs with foreign nations and unanimous advice of persons entitled to my confidence impelled me to abandon the idea. I rejoice that the state of your concerns, external as well as internal, no longer renders the pursuit of inclination incompatible with the sentiment duly of propriety. I am persuaded, whatever partiality may be retained for my services, that in the present circumstances of our country, you will not disapprove my determination to retire. The impressions with which I first undertook the arduous trust were explained in the proper occasion. In the discharge of this trust, I will only say that I have, with good intention, contributed toward the organizations and administration of the government with the best exertions of which our fallible judgment were capable. Not unconscious in the outset of the inferiority of my qualifications, experience, in my own eyes, perhaps still more in the eyes of others, has strengthened the motive and the diffidence of myself. And every day the increasing weight of years admonishes me more and more that the shade of retirement is as necessary to me as it will be welcome. Satisfied that if any circumstances have given peculiar value to my service, they were temporary. I have the consolation to believe that while choice and prudence invite me to quit, the political scene, patriotism does not forbid it. I look forward to the moment which is to terminate my career of my political life. My feelings do not permit me to suspend the deep acknowledgement of that debt of gratitude which I owe to my beloved country. For the many honors it has conferred upon me, still more for the steadfast confidence with which it has supported me, and for the opportunities I have thence enjoyed of manifesting my inviolable attachment by services faithful and preserving through the usefulness of unequal to my zeal. If benefits have resulted to our country from these services, let it always be remembered to your praise and as instructive example of our annals, that under circumstances in which passions agitated in every direction were liable to mislead amidst appearances sometimes dubious, vicissitudes of fortune often discouraging the situation in which not unfrequently a want of success has countenanced the spirit of criticism, the constancy of your support was an essential prop of the efforts and a guarantee of the plans by which they were effected. Profoundly penetrated with this idea, I shall carry it with me to my grave, as strong incitement of unceasing vows that heaven may continue to you the choicest tokens of its beneficence, that your union and brotherly affection may be perpetual, and that the free Constitution, which is the work of your hands, may be sacredly maintained, that its administration in every department may be stamped with wisdom and with virtue, that in fine, the happiness of people of these states under the auspices of liberty may be made complete by so careful a preservation, so prudent a use of its blessing as will require to them the glory of recommending it to the applause, the affection and adoption of every nation which is yet a stranger to it. Here perhaps I ought to stop, but a solicitude for your welfare which cannot end but with my life, and in the apprehension of danger natural to that solitude, urge me on an occasion like the present to offer your solemn contemplation and to recommend to your frequent review some sentiments which the results of much reflection, of no inconsiderable observation, and which appear to me all important to the permanency of your felicity as a people. These will be offered to you with the more freedom, as you can only see in them the disinterested warnings of a parting friend, who can possibly have no personal motive to his biased counsel. Nor can I forget as an encouragement to it your indulgent reception of my sentiments on a former and not dissimilar occasion. Interwoven as is the love of liberty with every ligament of your hearts, no recommendation of mine is necessary to fortify or confirm the attachment. The unity of government which constitutes you one people is now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, and of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that, from difficult causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as at this point in your political fortress against the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, though often covertly and insidiously directed. It is of infinite movement that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourself to think and speak of it as a palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety. Discontinuance or discounting whatever may suggest, even suspicious that it can, in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first drawing of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts. For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism, more than any other appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together the independence and liberty you possess, are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. But these considerations, however powerfully they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Here, every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for the carefully guarding and preserving the union of the whole. The North, in an unrestrained intercourse with the South, protected by the equal laws of common government, finds in the protection of the latter the greater additional resources of maritime and commercial enterprise, and precious materials of the manufacturing industry. The South, in the same intercourse, benefiting by the same agency as the North, sees its agriculture grow and its commerce expand. Turning partly into its own channels, the seamen of the North, it finds its particular navigation invigorated. And while it contributes in different ways to nourish the increase, the general mass of the national navigation, it looks forward to the protection of a maritime strength to which itself is unequally adapted. In the East, and like the intercourse with the West, already finds and in the progressive improvement of interior communications by land and water, will more and more find a valuable vent for the commodities which it brings from abroad or manufactures at home. The West derives from the East supplies requisite to its growth and comfort, and what is perhaps of still greater consequence, it must of necessity owe the secure enjoyment of indispensable outlets for its own productions to the weight, influence, and future maritime strength of the Atlantic side of the Union, directly by an indissoluble community of interest as one nation. Any other tenure by which the West can hold its essential advantage, whether derived from its own separate strength or from an apostate of unnatural connection with any foreign power, must be intrinsically precarious. While every part of our country thus feels an immediate and peculiar interest in a union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find the united mass of means and efforts. Greater strength, greater resource of proportionality, greater security from the external danger, a less frequent interruption by the peace of foreign nations, and what is of immeasurable value that must derive from a union, an exemption from those broils and the wars between themselves, which so frequently afflict neighboring countries and not tied together by the same government, which their own rivalship alone would be sufficient to produce, but which, opposite the foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues, would stimulate and embitter. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments which, under any form of government, are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to Republican liberty. In the sense it is that your union ought to be considered as the main prop of your liberty, and that the love of one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other. These considerations speak as pervasive language to ever-reflecting and virtuous mind, and exhibit the continuance of the Union as a primary object of patriotic desire. Is there a doubt whether a common government can embrace so large a sphere? Let expensive solve it? To listen to the speculation in such a case were criminal. We are authorized to hope that the proper organization of the whole with the auxiliary agency of government for the respective subdivisions will afford a happy issue to this experiment. It is well worth fair and full experiment. With such powerful and obvious motives to union affecting all parts of our country, while experience shall not have demonstrated its impracticality, there will always be reason to distrust the patriotism of those who in any quarter may endeavor to weaken its bands. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our Union, it occurs as matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished by characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that in there is a real difference of local interest and views. One of the expedients of a party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. The inhabitants of our western country have lately had a useful lesson on this head. They have seen in the negotiation by the executive and in the unanimous ratification by the Senate of the treaty with Spain, and in universal satisfaction at the event throughout the United States, a decisive proof of how unfounded were the suspicions propagated among them of a policy in the general government and in the Atlantic states unfriendly to their interests in regard to the Mississippi. They have been witnesses to the formation of two treaties, that with Great Britain and that with Spain, which secured to them everything they could desire in respect to our foreign relations towards confirming their prosperity. Will it not be their wisdom to rely for the preservation of these advantages on the union by which they were procured? Will they not henceforth be deaf to those advisers, if such they are, who would never sever them from the brethren and connect them with aliens? To the efficacy and permanency of your union, a government of the whole is indispensable. No alliances, however strict, between the parts can be an adequate substitute. They must inevitably experience the infractions and interpretations that all alliances at all times have experienced. Sensible of this momentous truth, you have improved upon your first essay by the adoption of a constitution of government better calculated than your former, for an intimate union and for edifice management of your common concerns. This government, the offspring of our own choice, uninfluenced and unwaved, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles and the distribution of its powers, uniting security with energy, and containing within it a provision for its own amendment, has just claimed to your confidence and your support. Respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures are duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. The basis of our political system is the right of people to make and to alter their constitutional government. But the Constitution which at any time exists until changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people is sacredly obligatory upon us all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. All obstructions to the execution of laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character and with real design to direct, control, counteract, or all the regular deliberations and actions of the constituted authorities are destructive to this fundamental principle and a fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it artificial and extraordinary force, to put in place the delegated will of the nation and the will of the party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community. And according to the alternative triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of ill, concerted, and incongruous projects of fraction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by commercial councils and modified by mutual interest. However combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people, and to usurp for themselves the reign of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which has lifted them to unjust dominion. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discountenance irregular opposition to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist the care, the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretext. One method of assault may be to the effect, in the form of the Constitution, alternations that will impair the energy of the system and thus undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. In all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least necessary to fix the true character of governments, as of other human institutions, that experience is the surest standard by which to test the real tendency of the existing continuation of a country, that facility in changes upon the credit of mere hypothesis and opinion exposes to perpetual change from endless variety of hypothesis and opinion. And remember especially that for the efficient management of your common interest in a country so extensive as ours, a government of as much vigor as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. Liberty itself will find in such a government, with powers properly distributed and adjusted, its surest guardian. It is indeed little else than a name, where government is too feeble to withstand the enterprise of faction, to confine each member of the society within the limits prescribed by laws, and to maintain all in the secure and tranquil enjoyment of the rights of person and property. I've already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discrimination. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of the party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stiff, controlled, or repressed. But in those of popular form, it is seen in the greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate dominion of the one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to the party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enmities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able to more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition of the purpose of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest of duty and a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and to serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true. And in governments of monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character, in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From the natural tendency, it is certain that there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose. And there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate it and assuage it. A fire not be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into flame, lest instead of warming it, should continue. It is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those trusted with its administration, to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres according to the exercise of powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominate in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of this position. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political powers, by dividing and distributing into different depositories and constituting each the guardian of the public will against an invasion of others, has been evinced by experiments ancient and modern, some of them in our country and under our own eyes. To preserve them must be the necessity as to institute them. If, in the opinion of people, the distribution of modification of constitutional powers may be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change or usurpation, for though thought this, in one instance may be an instrument of good, it is customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefits which the use can at any time yield. Of all dispositions of habits which lead to political prosperity, religion, and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would the man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert the pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life? If the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are instruments of investigation of courts of justice. And let us with caution indulge the superstition of morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be concealed to the influence of refined education on minds of people's structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national mortality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. It is substantially true that the virtue or morality is a necessity of spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government, who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric. Promote, then, in an objective of primary importance, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge, in proportion as the structure of government gives force to public opinion. It is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much other disbursements to repel it. Likewise, the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertions in times of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden to which we ourselves ought to bear. The execution of these maxims belong to your representatives, but it is necessary that public opinion should cooperate. To facilitate to them the performance of their duty, it is essential that you should practically bear in mind that towards the payments of debts there must be revenue, that to have revenue there must be taxes, that no tax can be devised which are not more or less inconvenient and unpleasant, that the intrinsic embarrassment inseparable from the selection of proper object, which is always a choice of difficulties, ought to be a decisive motive for a candid construction of the conduct of the government in making it, and for a spirit of acquiescence in the measures of obtaining revenue which the public exigencies may at any time dictate. Observe good faith, justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. Region and morality enjoin this conduct, and can it be good policy, does it not equally enjoin them? I will be worthy of free, enlightened, and at no distant period, a great nation, to give mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by exalted justice and benevolence. Who can doubt but in the course of time and things, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages which might be lost by steady adherence to it? Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent facility of a nation with its virtue? The experiment, at least, is recommended by every sentiment which enables human nature. Alas, it is rendered impossible by its vices. In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than the permanent invertebrate antipathy against particular nations and passionate attachment for others should be exalted, and then in place of them, just as amicable feelings toward all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to animosity or its affliction, either to which sufficient or to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. Antipathy in one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult to injury, to lay hold a slight cause of umbrage, and to be haughty and intractable when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. Hence, frequent collisions, obstinate, envenomed, and bloody contest. The nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels to war the government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. At other times, it makes the animosity of the nation subservient to the projects of hostility, investigated by pride, ambition, and other sinister and pernicious motives. The peace, often, sometimes, perhaps the liberty of nations, has been the victim. So likewise, a passionate attachment of one nation to another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation facilitating the inclusion of an imaginary common interest is cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of another betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels of wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justifications. It leads also to concessions to the favorite nation, of privileges denied to others, which is apt doubly to ensure the nation making the concessions by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained, and by existing jealousy, ill will, and disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are welcome or withheld. And it gives to ambition, corrupted or deluded citizens who devote themselves to favorite nation facility to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own country, without odium, sometimes even the popularity, gilding with the appearance of the virtuous sense of obligation, a commendable deference to public opinion, or a laudable zeal for public good, the base to foolish compliance of ambition, corruption, and infatuation. As avenues to foreign influence in innumerable ways, such attachments are particularly alarming to the truly enlightened and independent patriot. How many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead the public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils? Such an attachment of the small or weak towards a great and powerful nation dooms the former to be the satellite of the latter. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you, believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of a Republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial, else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided, instead of a defense against it. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike for another cause those who they actuate to see danger only on one side and serve to veil and even second the arts of influence on the other. Real patriots who may resist the intrigues of the favorite are liable to become suspected of the odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interest. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with good faith. But here let us stop. Europe has sent a set of primary interests which to us have none or very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics, or her policies, or ordinary combination of collisions of her friendship and enmities. Our detached and different situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. If we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance, where we may take such an attitude as will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon to be scrupulously respected. When belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard to be giving us provocation, when we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel. Why forego the advantages of so particular a situation? Why quit our own to stand up to foreign ground. Why? By interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. So far, I mean we are now at liberty to do it. For let me not be understood as capable of patronizing infidelity of existing engagements. I hold the maximum no less applicable to public than private affairs, that honesty is always the best policy. I repeat it, therefore, let those engagements be observed in their genuine sense, but in my opinion it is unnecessary and would be unwise to extend them. Taking care always to keep ourselves, by suitable establishment, on a respectable defense posture, we may safely trust to the temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. Harmony and a liberal intercourse with all nations are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest. But even our commercial policy should hold an equal impartial hand, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting in the natural course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means the stems of commerce, by forcing nothing. Establishing with powers so disposed in order to give trade a stable course, to define the rights of our merchants and to enable the government to support them. Conventional rules of intercourse, the best that present circumstances and mutual opinion, will permit, but temporarily, and liable to be from time to time abandoned or varied as experience and circumstances shall dictate. Constantly keeping in view that it is folly in one nation to look for disinterested favors from another, that it must pay a portion of its independence for whatever it may accept under that character, that by such acceptance it may place itself in the condition of having given equivalent phenomenal favors and yet being reproached by ingratitude for not giving more. There can be no greater error than to expect or calculate upon the real favors from nation to nation. It's an illusion which experience must cure, which a just pride ought to discard. In offering you, my countrymen, these counsels of an old and affectionate friend, I dare not hope that we will make the strong and lasting impression I could wish, and they will continue the usual current of the passions or prevent our nation from running the course which it has hitherto marked the destiny of nations. But if I may even flatter myself that they may be productive of some partial benefit, some occasional good, that they may now and then recur to moderate the fury of party spirit, to warn against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue, and to guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism, this hope will be full recompense for the solicitude for your welfare by which they have been dictated. How far in the discharge of my official duties I have been guided by the principles which have been delineated, the public record, and other evidences of my conduct must witness to you and to the world. To myself, the assurance of my own conscience is that I have at least believed myself to be guided by them. In relation to still subsisting war in Europe, my proclamation of the 22nd of April, 1793, is the index to my plan. Sanctioned by your approving voice and by that of your representatives in both houses of Congress, the spirit of that measure has continually governed me, uninfluenced by any attempt to divert or deter me from it. After deliberate examination, with the aid of the best lights I could obtain, I was well satisfied that our country, under all the circumstances of the case, had a right to take and was bound in duty and interest to take the neutral position. Having taken it, I determined, as far as I could depend upon me, to maintain it in moderation, perseverance, and firmness. The considerations with respect to the right to hold this conduct it is not necessary on this occasion to detail. I will only observe that according to my understanding of the matter, that right, so far from being denied by any of the belligerent powers, has been virtually admitted by all. The duty of holding a neutral conduct may be inferred without anything more from the obligation which justice and humanity impose on every nation, in cases in which it is free to act, to maintain inviolate and relations of peace, amity towards other nations. The inducements of interest for observing that conduct will be best referred to our own reflections and experience. With me, a predominant motive has been to endeavor to gain time to our country to settle and mature its yet recent institutions, and to progress without interruption to that degree of strength and consistency which is necessary to give it, humanly speaking, the command of its own fortunes. Though in reviewing the instance of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. Wherever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service, with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. Relying on its kindness, in this as in other things, and actuated by the fervent love towards it, which is so natural to a man who views in the native soil of himself his progenitors for several generations, I anticipate with pleasing expectation the retreat to which I promise myself to realize, without alloy, the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens, the benign influence of good laws under the free government, the event favorite object of my heart, the happy reward, as I trust, to our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. George Washington, the United States, 17 December, 1796.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
First, let me congratulate the senator from Georgia for his excellent presentation of George Washington's farewell address. It's been an important Senate tradition for many years, and I thank him for his reading that for all of us on this important occasion. Mr. President, on another matter, I want to start by welcoming everyone back from the recess. It's good to be back. Time away from Washington is an opportunity to step back and to measure the priorities of party against those of people who sent us here, to make sure that they're properly aligned. As the two parties re-engage this week in a debate about our nation's finances, it's vital that we focus not on mere partisan advantage, but on what's right for the nation. When it comes to the two choices before us of either maintaining an unsustainable status quo on spending or to begin to start cutting spending, the choice could not be more clear. This morning's news brought word that a 47-member panel of some of the nation's top business economists view government overspending as the top threat to our economy. In other words, a majority of those experts think that Washington's inability to live within its means is the single greatest threat to our nation's economic future. This isn't a groundbreaking observation. After all, Americans have been telling lawmakers for more than 2 years that business as usual simply will not cut it anymore. They want us to get our fiscal house in order and to start to create the right conditions for private sector job growth. But today's news is further confirmation of the stakes in the debate over spending, and that Democrats in Congress need to rethink the approach they've taken up to now. The message from the November elections is quite clear. Stop spending money we don't have. Yet Democratic leaders persist in defending budgets that do just that well into the future. Earlier this month, the President unveiled a 10-year budget for the government. At no point in this 10-year projection, would the government spend less than it takes in. It doesn't even try. Just look at the estimates for this year alone. Unless we start to cut this year's projected spending, Washington will spend more than $1.5 trillion more than it takes in. $1.5 trillion more than it takes in this year. About $350 billion more in red ink than we had last year. That's $350 billion more in red ink than we had last year. Think about that. a $350 billion increase in deficit spending over last year, after an election in which the voters unambiguously said they want us to cut spending and stop adding debt. And next year, Democrats in Congress want us to do it again. Once again, they plan to spend more than $1 trillion more than we take in. Same pattern the year after that. They want to spend hundreds of billions of dollars more than we take in. And on and on and on. Now, all of this overspending, of course, just adds to our overall debt. And when you add it all up, the numbers are truly staggering. As a result of Democrat budgets, the federal debt just 5 years from now is expected to exceed $20 trillion. 5 years from now, $20 trillion. Interest payments alone on that debt will exceed $500 billion a year. That's just interest payments on the $20 trillion debt, $500 billion a year. Talk about a disconnect. The American people have spent the last 2 years trying to get their own fiscal houses in order. Millions have lost their jobs. Millions more have lost their homes. Meanwhile, what have the Democrats in Washington been up to? Well, on the day the president was sworn into office, the national debt was $10.6 trillion. In the 25 months since, it's increased by $3.5 trillion. And despite a national uprising over this profligacy and an election that represented a wholesale repudiation of it, here's the president's response: spend more. He calls it investments. What about Democratic leaders in Congress? Are they reading the writing on the wall? Well, until this past weekend, they insisted they couldn't agree to cut a dime in spending, not a dime. Rather than look for ways that the two parties can work together to rein in spending, they looked for ways to marginalize those who are working hard to come up with ways to do it. They called anybody who wanted to cut a dime in spending an extremist. I'll tell you what's extreme, Mr. President. What's extreme is $20 trillion in debt. That's what's extreme. $500 billion in interest payments a year is extreme. Refusing to agree to even try to live within your means is extreme. Tomorrow, the House will have a vote on a 2-week spending bill. This bill represents an effort to change the culture here in Washington. It says, let's start to change the mentality around here. Let's find $4 billion that all of us can agree to cut and cut it, and continue from that good start. Democratic leaders in Congress resisted even this up until a few days ago. Now they've started to suggest they might be willing to agree to it. This is progress. So this week, Democrats will have an opportunity to show they've gotten the message. They can show they agree the time has come to change the status quo. Less spending, lower debt, reining in the size and scope of government. That's what's needed. That's how we will create the conditions for private sector job growth. Now, Democratic leaders in Congress have tried record spending and deficits. What's it gotten us? More than $3 trillion more in debt and 3 million more jobs lost. $3 trillion in new debt while we lost 3 million jobs. Democrats have an opportunity this week to show they get it. They have an opportunity to show that the status quo on spending and debt is no longer an option, to turn a corner. A lot depends on how they respond to that opportunity. Will they continue to see what they can get away with? Or will they finally concede that the old way of doing business must come to an end? Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
Majority Leader.
As consent, the call quorum be terminated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, following any leader remarks, there will be a period of morning business until 3:30 today. Senators during that period of time will be able to speak for up to 10 minutes. At 3:30, we'll move to consideration of S-23, which is Patent Reform Act. At 4:30, the Senate will turn to executive session to consider the nominations of Amy Tottenberg of Georgia to be United States District Judge and Steve Jones of Georgia to be United States District Judge. The time until 5:30 will be equally divided and controlled in the usual form. At 5:30, Senators should expect a voice vote on confirmation of the Tottenberg nomination to be followed by a roll call vote on confirmation of the Jones nomination. We hope to complete action on the patent reform bill and considering a continuing resolution during this week's session.
Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 3:30 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
From Tennessee.
Mr. President, yes, unanimous consent that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today, Mr. President, to talk about our dilemma here in the federal government where the American people are watching as we try to deal with our spending issues. I know there's a big debate over a 2-week spending issue where we try to cut $4 billion. Hopefully some resolve will come to that. But I think what the American people are watching is that unless there is some type of gun to our head or some type of urgent situation in front of us, we don't have the ability in this body to deal with spending issues in a disciplined nor courageous way. I think everybody understands that, and they understand the only way we're looking at whatever spending cuts take place, and I know right now there's discussions over what they might be, but the only reason this issue is being addressed is that we have this deadline of government funding ending in the next week or so. And Mr. President, I know another presiding officer is someone who served as a county mayor and had to balance budgets each year and had to figure out a way to live within our means. And I know that upon arriving here a few months ago, you had to be just totally aghast at the fact that we are taking in $2.2 trillion this year and spending $3.7 trillion this year. And if you put all the discretionary spending that we had, if you took every bit of, quote, non-mandatory spending or discretionary spending off the table, we still wouldn't have a balanced budget. And so everybody in this country, I think, knows that where we are is totally out of line. We're spending about a little over 24% of our country's economic output today. And over the last 40 years, we've spent about 20.6% of our country's GDP. So, Mr. President, I've put in place, with Claire McCaskill from Missouri, a bill. We have numbers of co-sponsors. We put in something called the CAP Act, and we hope that over the course of this next year, it's a bill that will, over the course of the next several months, that this is a bill that will actually pass. And what it does, I think in a very logical way, is it says that we're spending at levels relative to our economy today that are out of proportion, and let's go from where we are today to the 40-year average over a 10-year period. Now, Mr. President, as presiding, it's just a logical thing that gives us time to go from where we are today over the next 10 years to where the country has been spending relative to our country's output for the last 40 years. What this also does, Mr. President, is it puts Congress in a straitjacket. Again, I think everybody's watching and knowing that if we didn't have this CR, this continuing resolution bill that was ending this week, and if government wasn't going to shut down if it wasn't funded, there would be no negotiations taking place right now over spending. We all know that. And so what this does is put in place a straitjacket on Congress, one that's very needed, unfortunately, to take us from here to there over a 10-year period. And what happens if we don't meet the requirements of this declining spending relative to our economy, then sequestration comes into place. And what happens is the OMB comes in and on a pro rata basis, based on which accounts, what their relative weight is to the overall spending levels, comes in and just takes out on a pro rata basis out of every account of government. Mr. President, one of the problems that we've had in this country is we want to deal with those things that are easy, and that is discretionary spending. In many cases, it ends up being non-defense discretionary spending, which ends up being about $600 billion roughly of the $3.7 trillion that we're spending. And everybody in the world knows there's no way for us to solve our problem by only dealing with discretionary spending. So what this bill would do is put all items on the balance sheet. In other words, it would include all of the entitlements. And I don't think there's a person in this body that believes if we continue as we are, the seniors that are counting on things like Medicare and Social Security, we all know that if we don't redesign these programs so they'll be sustained for the long haul, then seniors that are counting on these programs are not going to have them. And so what this bill would do is force us in Congress to deal with designing these programs in such a way that they would be here for the long haul. So it puts everything on the table. And again, there's not a thinking person in Washington that doesn't know that we have to address these issues. Now, there are a lot of people that say, well, you know, we cannot really do these draconian things right now because we're in the middle of a recession, which hopefully looks like that it's changing, and hopefully changing very rapidly. But these changes would begin from where we are in the year 2013. So you'd have a year or so to redesign these programs so we could act in an appropriate way to really ensure that they were here for the future, but also put them in place in a manner that doesn't kill the American taxpayer. So, Mr. President, we'd cap spending. We've got multi-year averaging processes in this bill to make sure that if you have a change in the economy in 1 year, you don't just have this volatile situation, but that we have the ability a year in advance to know what the appropriate spending levels are. It gives Congress the ability to act upon that throughout the year. If Congress doesn't act, then 45 days after a year ends, OMB comes in again and puts in place something called sequestration, just automatically takes money out of these accounts. That, Mr. President, I think gives us the impetus to want to make sure that we actually act. I don't think there's anybody here in Congress that would want OMB just coming in and taking money out of account. So that would be, in essence, the thing that would give us the sense of urgency that we badly need in this body. Mr. President, this is a problem that exists on both sides of the aisle. That's why I've sought bipartisan support for this bill. I've tried to put something in place that is very logical. I know that's not often the case here, but something that Americans across our country can understand, but also those here in Washington will see is something that is really working towards a solution to get us where we need to go. I think all of us understand the demographic changes that are taking place in our country. I think all of us know that over the next 10 years, 20 million more Americans are going to be on Medicare. Almost 20 million more Americans will be on Social Security. And we're right on the cusp of that bubble that I'm certainly getting ready to be a part of, not necessarily the presiding officer. But the point is, this is something that has to occur for the good of our country. So this is called the CAP Act. Again, what it will do, Mr. President, is ensure that long after the point in time when this CR window opens and closes, long after the time the debt ceiling vote, which will happen a little bit later this year, occurs, long after those occur, and the American people have moved on to other issues, and obviously Congress has moved on to other issues, we keep in place this fiscal discipline, this straitjacket, to take us where we need to go. The presiding officer and I were in Pakistan and Afghanistan last week, and we witnessed some of the problems that we're having there. We also witnessed the brilliance of our men and women in uniform and also many hardworking individuals at the State Department. And while those threats are threats, the threats that we're dealing with there are threats that are very important to the American people, I think most of us know the biggest threat today to our country is our inability to deal appropriately with our financial circumstances. And I think we all know that if we don't deal with that pretty soon, we're going to be putting our country's future in jeopardy, the future of these wonderful pages that sit in front of me, putting their futures in jeopardy. Mr. President, the thing that's fascinating about this issue is that unlike the things we saw in Pakistan and the things we saw in Afghanistan where we're relying on other people, this is something that we can do ourselves. We have 100% control over spending in Washington. 100% of that is held in the hands of 100 senators and 435 House members. This is not something where we're depending on other countries or we're concerned about what might happen elsewhere. This is something that we ourselves can deal with. So what I've tried to put in place with Claire McCaskill and others, and there are growing numbers of other people who are part of this process, is to try to put something in place that causes us to be responsible to the American people. So I hope that others will join this. It's my hope that what we'll do is three things. I hope that we will vote and pass on cuts in federal spending today. I hope that will happen over the next short period of time. Whether it's some of the things that we're looking at on the CR, maybe it's recommendations that have been put in place by the President's Deficit Reduction Commission, but I hope that what we will do as a body is go ahead and vote and pass real cuts now. Secondarily, what I hope will happen is we'll put in place something like the CAP Act to make sure that we continue that fiscal discipline long after people move on to other topics, that we keep that straitjacket in place so that we do those things that, again, are responsible not only to generations now but future generations. And then thirdly, I hope we figure out a way through some type of amendment to ensure that on into the future, we've put something in place at the federal level that causes us to be fiscally responsible in this country. All of us know what it means to have to make choices. All of us have households. Many of us have led cities and states. Many of us have had businesses. we all understand that that's what happens in the real world, and it's something that certainly needs to happen here and has been sorely lacking for a long time. So, Mr. President, I thank you for the time on the floor here today. I hope to talk about this many, many times. I've been doing it, I assure you, throughout the state of Tennessee and in multiple forums here in the Senate. I thank you for the time, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.